A single powerful legal phrase with prejudice. It's now tied directly to the largest defamation payout in history. When we see these hundreds of millions of dollars changing hands after the 2020 U.S. election, what does that massive financial hit really mean for journalism, for scrutinizing elections?
Well, it means we're fundamentally changing the cost.
Hmm.
The cost of being an opposition voice. We're seeing this systemic shift where if you challenge how these private companies contracted by the government operate, well, the financial risk is just astronomical. Few can actually survive it.
And that's exactly why we're here today. Our mission is a deep dive into this high-stakes legal aftermath of 2020. We're going to unpack those specific claims of irregularities, the ones that fueled so much public distrust. We'll analyze the absolutely jaw-dropping defamation settlements that came next, and we'll break down that crucial legal idea: dismissing a case with prejudice versus without prejudice. We'll use these recent cases to show you exactly what it means. We really want you to walk away understanding why this whole legal drama has such huge implications for free speech. Okay, let's start with just the sheer scale. The price tag alone tells a story of, well, deterrence. You had the Dominion voting systems lawsuit against Fox News. The settlement, $787.5 million. That is the largest defamation payout ever recorded, period. And separately, you have former Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani. He settled a $1.3 billion suit with Dominion and then was also ordered to pay another $148 million in a separate case to two Georgia election workers.
Right, and don't forget the confidential settlements. Smartmatic, another software company, settled with outlets like Newsmax. We don't even know those numbers. But taken together, these astronomical figures, they kind of formalize this systemic danger we mentioned. Criticism aimed at these private companies doing government work, it can now potentially be crushed by just massive litigation. When you see a number like $787 million, you have to ask, right, does that just kill editorial courage? The sources we analyzed argue pretty strongly that this poses a really serious challenge to the health of the opposition press.
Okay, let's rewind a bit. Let's unpack the initial spark. What actually ignited this whole firestorm, that context of public distrust? According to the source material we looked at, right after the 2020 results came in, a huge number, 70% of Trump voters, were convinced there was widespread election fraud. And this conviction, it wasn't just out of thin air. It was fueled by what observers called, well, shocking and specific irregularities.
Yeah, and the foundation for that intense distrust, based on the sources, was really the procedural chaos. You saw these Democrat lawsuits using COVID-19 as a justification, overturning state voting laws that had been in place for a long time. And this was happening like at the last second. This allowed basically an unknown number of ballots to arrive late. And this big shift to unsupervised mail-in balloting, it drew heavy criticism from observers. They said it opened elections to the likelihood of massive fraud and chaos. One source put it pretty bluntly, saying it made it possible for an unscrupulous faction to potentially just come up with the votes after Election Day.
And all this procedural mess, it led directly to these statistical anomalies that raised the biggest alarms for people. What really stood out were maybe three specific kinds of data points. First, the counting just stopped. States like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, they made this unexplained move, stopping the release of vote counts on election night. That was unusual. Then, hours later, boom, huge batches of fresh Biden votes were reported. And you saw Trump's betting odds, which had been really high, around 85% peak, just plummet.
And the most cited example, the one you heard about constantly, was that specific instance in Michigan. Almost 150,000 votes reportedly added in one go, and nearly all of them went to Biden. Only about 6,000 for Trump in that batch. That stuck out.
But the statistical weirdness, it went deeper, right, into the mail-in data itself. That's the second key data point people focused on. Observers noted that Biden got just an unbelievable amount of the mail-in share, like 80% in Pennsylvania. His lead among mail-in voters there was 60 points. In Michigan, up nearly 40 points. And you need to remember, this scale, this magnitude, it far exceeded his mail-in advantage in other key battleground states. There, the advantage was often just single digits.
Right. And then the third type of evidence was more anecdotal but still powerful for many. You had dozens of witnesses signing affidavits, swearing under penalty of perjury about wrongdoing they saw. There were claims from Detroit poll challengers saying election workers counted ballots for people who weren't eligible voters. You had sworn affidavits from USPS employees alleging their bosses told them to backdate ballots to make them seem like they arrived on time.
And there were confirmed machine issues, too. The sources called the voting software itself the spookiest thing. Several errors related to Dominion machines were confirmed. And here's the kicker. All of them took votes away from Trump and gave them to Biden. Every single confirmed error.
Now, Dominion quickly said, oh, that was user error. But Republicans, according to the sources, were really unsatisfied. They pointed out there wasn't a clear way to even flag the issue systemically, suggesting maybe the problem could be much bigger, magnified across the country. So we've laid out the arguments, the evidence cited by sources that fueled this huge public distrust. But of course, the courts ultimately saw things very differently, didn't they? What did the final judicial ruling say? Well, multiple legal figures, scholars, they found no credible evidence that fraud changed the outcome, not even in a single precinct. And it's important to note, for context, that the courts really did look at the merits of these claims in case after case. They often dismissed them on substance, even if there were also procedural reasons they could have used, like standing.
Okay, which brings us right to that core legal term, the one that defines absolute final closure. Rudy Giuliani settles his $1.3 billion defamation lawsuit with Dominion, and that agreement explicitly included the dismissal of all claims with prejudice. Now, for you listening at home, this is where we need that eighth grade level explanation, because these two words, with prejudice, they dictate if a case is truly dead forever or not.
Absolutely. It's crucial. Think of it like this. Dismissal with prejudice means the case is shut down permanently. That's it. It's treated legally as if the core issue, the merit of the case, has been decided and settled for good. It means the plaintiff, in this case, Dominion against Giuliani, cannot come back later and try to sue again for the exact same thing. Even if they find, say, new evidence down the road, those specific claims against that specific defendant, extinguished, done. This is why someone bringing a lawsuit, like a prosecutor or a plaintiff, will almost never voluntarily agree to dismiss with prejudice unless maybe they feel they've hit a dead end, or in a settlement like this, they've gotten enough compensation to say, okay, we're closing the book forever.
Hold on, so just to be crystal clear, that settlement with Giuliani, because it was with prejudice, Dominion cannot come back and relitigate those specific defamation claims against him ever again. Not for that same cause of action.
That's precisely right. That door is locked and bolted. Now contrast that with the other option, dismissal without prejudice. That means the dismissal is not permanent. The door is still open a crack. The plaintiff is allowed to refile the lawsuit later for the same reason, as long as they're still within the legal time limit, the statute of limitations. This happens sometimes if, say, a key witness suddenly won't cooperate, or if the plaintiff feels they need more time to gather better evidence to shore up their case, as lawyers say. It's more like a pause button than a stop button.
Wow. And the personal consequences of this legal reality, especially for figures like Giuliani, they're just devastating. You see the real cost of this financial deterrence playing out. He's struggling to pay these massive legal bills, that $148 million to the Georgia election workers, plus whatever the confidential Dominion settlement was. I mean, that level of financial ruin. He's selling his Manhattan apartment. He held a $100,000 a plate fundraiser, and yet even his own son admitted publicly that the fundraising won't be enough to get through this. It's not just a fine, it's like total financial destruction for him.
Which really forces us, I think, to look beyond just the individuals involved. We have to focus on the long-term systemic implications of these huge settlements. And the sources we looked at frame this as a clear danger to press freedom, really across the board.
What's concerning there, reading the analysis, is how the legal definition of defamation itself might be shifting. Or could shift. For decades, you had the New York Times v. Sullivan standard. The press defense was basically, you could be wrong even about public figures, as long as you didn't show reckless disregard for the truth. Pretty high bar. Now, some argue, based on these outcomes, that standard might be morphing into something more like reckless disagreement with the prevailing opinion, or just failing to confirm the narrative that powerful actors, public and private, agree on.
And that potential shift, it seems to be fueled by some subtle but really crucial judicial decisions noted in the sources. Think about how language is interpreted. The sources point to a judicial insistence on a highly literal distinction between facts and opinions. So like a TV host saying, "I know," while asking a question. That could potentially be twisted into a statement of fact, making the host liable for defamation. That's a very literal reading. And furthermore, Judge Eric Davis in the Fox case denied Fox the ability to defend its reporting simply because the claims were newsworthy. If that protection, which historically shields journalists reporting on significant, even if disputed claims, is weakened or removed, well, defamation cases suddenly become much, much easier to win against media outlets.
Let me try putting that another way based on the sources. A major new development seems to be holding the interviewer responsible for what the interviewee says. Under the old understanding of media law, punishing a network for just interviewing someone, even someone whose claims sounded batty, like spokespeople for the president, that would have been almost impossible if they were newsworthy figures. Now, the implication is networks can be financially punished just for airing those claims. That puts a massive chilling effect on who they even feel safe interviewing.
Exactly. And this leads us straight to the core systemic vulnerability that the sources warn about. They use the metaphor of plutocracy. Think about it. Dominion holds election contracts in 28 states. That's a huge footprint. The argument laid out is, if a private company is performing a core government function like running elections, and then it's allowed to use massive lawsuits, $787 million lawsuits, to demand payment for reputational damage, well, you're formalizing a really dangerous overlap between public power and private financial interests.
So you're saying the scrutiny that should be applied to government activities, when those activities are handled by a private company, gets met instead with crippling lawsuits that just shut down the criticism. It creates a chilling effect.
Precisely. And this systemic vulnerability, the sources warn, could stretch way beyond just election tech. Think about any private entity critics might want to scrutinize. Private military contractors overseas, private prisons, companies managing critical federal infrastructure. If challenging how they operate or questioning their integrity carries this kind of massive financial liability, then robust investigative journalism in those sectors just becomes financially impossible for most outlets. The cost of asking difficult, uncomfortable questions has suddenly shot up by hundreds of millions of dollars.
So let's recap. We've reviewed those specific claims that generated so much intense distrust after the 2020 election. We've tracked the unprecedented financial fallout, these massive defamation suits, and we've learned how critical legal terms, like with prejudice, really define the absolute finality of these disputes.
And the outcome, looking at the analysis provided in the sources, seems pretty clear. The sheer weight of this financial deterrence severely restricts the ability of, particularly, the opposition press to conduct what they call robust and unbullied scrutiny of things like election integrity. And since, as we noted, 50 million Americans found the initial allegations plausible, the sources raise this ultimate, very sobering question. If one side of the political spectrum, the right in this case, starts to feel that the rules of the game, the election rules, no longer apply fairly because challenging the process itself is financially prohibitive, what happens when people feel that elections just don't matter anymore? The fear, as implied by the sources, is that the only path left to settle deep political differences becomes force and violence, implying we might be approaching a really dangerous point, a point of no return, or maybe, the modern version of crossing the Rubicon. A truly chilling thought to end on.